Alva, I remember as an undergraduate, I took my first philosophy course and introduced to the mind-body problem. And I already had been interested in the brain, but it so excited me to see this problem having been thought about by the greatest thinkers in modern history in terms of how we understand what we are in terms of this mind-body problem. So I want to come to you and get your take on what is the mind-body problem, but the particular orientation is that over the last maybe century, certainly the last few decades for sure, there's more and more coalescing around this identity between the mind and the brain, content identity, that one is really the other.
There isn't a mind-body problem. There are many mind-body problems. And I think something that is a little bit confusing when one starts to think about these questions is realizing that. In a way, the big issue that's lurking in the vicinity here is mind belongs to our nature. How do we understand it in a way that coheres with the rest of our understanding of nature? That is, can there be a science of the mind that sort of fits with our worldview? In a way, that's the big question. But there are many other mind-body problems that are, if you like, a little bit more local or a little bit more subtle. For instance, the body. The body of an animal is not merely matter. It's the living body of an animal. It's, if you like, already part of the space in which we find mind. So one of the questions that we can ask as the mind-body problem is, what is the relation between my capacities for cognition, for perception, for language, and my particular embodiment? Being built the way I am, with a brain like the brain I have, and with a body plan like the body plan I have. The body, the actual body, is so important. We are habitual creatures. We have all sorts of bodily skills. When I walk into the room, I don't need to think, let's see, where's the light switch? My body knows where the light switch is. So my cognitive life is very much bound up with my possession of a body like this. In a way, my body is my tool. I'm at home with my tools. But then there's other questions. There's the problem of mental causation. How is it that a thought can bring about a change in the physical environment? This is a serious problem, since on the one hand, we believe that every physical event has a physical cause, and we think that you can't have an overdetermination of causes. So what work does the mind do? The mind must be, in some sense, epiphenomenal. This is another route to the idea.
Epiphenomenal meaning that the brain is doing all this work and gives the illusion. Well, the consciousness is real, but it's kind of one-way causation. That the mind is kind of a residual of what the brain does, but the mind has no, even though it thinks it has causative impact on the brain, it really doesn't. It's just sitting there with.
It's causally inert. Yeah. That's right. That's the idea.
It doesn't think so.
We don't think that way about our mental lives. We think that we make decisions, and as a result of decisions, certain things happen. So, and then there's other. I just want to kind of call attention to the many different other kinds of mind-body problems there are. One of the big questions that gets discussed in this area is our knowledge of our own minds. We seem to have a certain kind of authoritative, immediate, first-person acquaintance with the contents of our own consciousness. We seem to have a kind of acquaintance with the contents of our own consciousness that we can never have with the minds of others. So one of the big questions in this vicinity is how can I know what you're thinking, what you're feeling, when, so it might seem, all I'm really given is what you say and what you do, which would seem to be at a remove from that going on inside you, which causes you to say what you say, and in virtue of which you do what you do.
Right. The problem of other minds.
Exactly, the problem of other minds. So the whole question then of mind-brain identity unfolds against the background of really trying to make sense of all these different issues.
These different mind-body problems.
These different mind-body problems, and there are others. I mean, there are many different kinds of mental events. There are wishes, there are desires, there are hopes, there are memories, there are seeings, there are judgments, there are linguistic competences, our game playing abilities, our interpersonal skills, thanks to which we can live at all.
Well, some would say these are all higher order things that are just emergent from the same kinds of brain activity at the more fundamental level, and expresses itself in ways that seem to us different, but they're really the same.
Yeah. One of the things that makes the whole business very tricky is that we come to the table as people, before we're scientists, before we're philosophers, we come to the table with a kind of, with a general way of thinking about other people's thoughts, beliefs, desires, actions, why they do things, how to make sense of what's going on in the social world around us, and how to make sense of ourselves. And it's sort of an interesting question that has definitely been pushed by both scientists and philosophers, whether or not these kind of folk psychological tools that we're raised with have any use for science. Maybe science needs to leave talk of feelings, beliefs, desires, and thoughts aside and develop some new vocabulary for taxonomizing the phenomena that we can hope to get a glimpse at in just the way that biologists need to go beyond cliches about the heart and the mind in order to make progress in biology.
Let me tell you a secret, that most neuroscientists think that philosophers who deal with this mind-body problem, which has obsessed me, are really, at best, irrelevant, and at worst, interfering with true science. And that true science has replaced, and rightly so, all of this folderol of philosophers dealing with the mind-body problem. If we want to understand the mind and the brain, we have to do science, and we should forget about philosophy.
I applaud science for tackling the nature of mind. After all, our mental powers and capacities that we think, that we feel, that the world shows up for us is part of our nature, and science is in the business of studying nature. So that's great. This idea that there's an opposition between science and philosophy is something I completely reject. In fact, I think that the fact that the problem of consciousness or the problem of the mind is a scientific problem makes it nonetheless philosophical for all that. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that many of the scientists working in this area, in fact, simply are, without necessarily paying attention to the fact that this is what they're doing, taking stands on philosophical questions, and often doing so in a rather naive way. We criticize the dualists for thinking that mind stuff or spirit stuff explains our mental lives. It's just a name for a mystery. But what is really impressive is to appreciate that saying that it's the brain that explains this stuff is actually no less than talking about spirit, a placeholder for explanations that we don't have. The fact is that we don't really have much of a clue how neural activity makes us conscious.
The difference, though, scientists would say, is there is no hope of doing any science of dualism, of trying to study the spirit stuff. But there is not only hope of understanding the brain, there's been enormous progress over the last few decades. We really understand a great deal more. We have many different correlations of different aspects of our consciousness and different modalities, and we're making progress, and we'll get there eventually. But that philosophers should keep out of our way.
Philosophy must certainly pay close attention to what's going on in the empirical sciences. But it's very important for the empirical sciences to realize that philosophy sometimes crops up within the scientific enterprise itself. That's what I mean when I say it's a pity that there's this opposition between philosophy and science. Sociologically, yeah, there's philosophy professors and there's physics professors or neuroscience professors. But if we're interested in nature, well, nature throws philosophical curveballs at us as well as empirical curveballs. And what we need in the science of consciousness, more than anything else, is a kind of conceptual reorientation that can enable us to ask the right empirical questions. And there's now good reason to think, empirical, conceptual, philosophical, methodological, there's good empirical reason for thinking that we're not going to find that place in the brain where consciousness happens. not because consciousness happens in an immaterial place or in a kind of unnatural way, but simply because consciousness isn't that kind of thing. And it's frankly an outdated philosophical confusion made by many a practicing neuroscientist, even Nobel Prize winning scientists, I might add, that we should be looking for what Daniel Dennett has called the Cartesian theater.
But scientists would say that if you look at the history of the philosophers and dealing with the philosophy of mind, you see an endless stream of ideas flowing one after the other and absolutely no progress being made. The only progress that has occurred is with neuroscience in the last few decades.
It saddens me to have to say that very little progress has been made in neuroscience on these questions. We have elaborate technologies that our institutions have invested lots of money on, and that many a grant has been devoted to acquiring. But these technologies, the new brain imaging labs and so on, are not actually adding up to an understanding of how it is that the actions of brain cells give rise to that characteristic experience which we call visual experience. The truth is, we're not a single step closer to answering that question than we were 100 years ago. And this is not a controversial claim. Any scientist trying to understand human experience would acknowledge that. We have a much more refined sense about, a much more refined understanding of the neural structures that are necessary for consciousness. But at the very beginning, we knew that if you chop someone's head off, you lose their consciousness. Or if you lop this part of their brain off, we lose their consciousness. But what we don't understand is, if you like, from a brain's level view up, how neural activity makes for consciousness. We're not closer. We haven't made progress in that area.